Hi, I'm Hannah.
Hi, I'm Jenna.
Hey, I'm Paul.
Paul and I were working on a project related to calls for proposals, so conference CFPs that had been issued in our field of rhetoric and composition. And we quickly found something that we had in common, which is that we did not understand the CFPs, and we sort of bonded over that. There was one year's in particular that I found really inaccessible. And I remember meeting with some colleagues to talk about brainstorming. We wanted to get feedback on our research. And as individuals with PhDs in the field, we barely understood what it meant. And ideally, with rhetorical equity, you don't want people to be asking that question. You don't want them to be wondering, is there something wrong with me? Why don't I get this?
My background is looking at technology and critiquing it, thinking about, how it could be redesigned, how it's inequitable and unfair. And something that I've learned about technology is that most of the time when technology doesn't work, people blame themselves. They think it's their fault. When, more often than not, it's really poor technological design. And a lot of times when I'm, reading things that are related to rhetoric and composition, I've found that I'm having trouble really understanding it, or I don't feel really part of the discourse. And I've been thinking about how, is that my fault? Should I feel this sort of shame? There was this CFP that came out, I think it's 2018, and it was something about languaging was part of it. I think it was a Sao Inouye's CFP, and I didn't really get what languaging was. It was hard to follow the discourse and what was being talked about, and I felt, really, I felt ashamed that here I am, an expert in, this field, but I had real trouble following this and didn't know where I could connect. So I went to the Writing Center. I talked with Hannah, actually. She's a undergraduate Writing Center tutor, and I've never done that before. I just felt so frustrated, and so I talked about it with her.
So, this concept of rhetorical equity was something that I really started thinking about back when I was an undergraduate Writing Center tutor. This was when Paul came to talk to me in the Writing Center about a call for proposals about languaging. Now, before that, if there was something in an article that I couldn't understand, I assumed it was because I was a bad English major or because I was dumb. But I assumed that all my professors could engage with all of the academic discourse and that type of jargon and understood it all. But Paul coming to me in the Writing Center made me really start to wonder if the language used within certain disciplines was actually alienating people who were trying to be part of those conversations, and if there are ways that these texts could be made more readable, perhaps more interactive in different modalities, and overall more rhetorically equitable.
And she helped me, you know, figure it out. We talked more about it and just made me realize that this is kind of a problem. Like if you want, people to get involved, to be access your work, access the concepts, access ideas, that it might be better, you know, to practice rhetorical equity and come at it with different types of texts and different angles for helping people
And
know.
now I am working as an academic librarian. Uh, I work in research and instruction, helping students with research, finding articles, and instructing them in those skills. And something that I often tell them is if they don't understand the language being used to describe the research, it's often better to just move on and try to find a more accessible article that uses less jargon, as they're often under time constraints. If your paper is due tomorrow, you don't have hours to spend wrestling with a jargony text, which is really a shame because they're not able to fully engage them in these conversations that are happening in research that is very relevant to them as students and as emerging scholars, and is something I think about every day. I do think that rhetorical equity is something that is incredibly important to apply to other disciplines outside that of rhetoric and composition studies. I now work in an academic library at a 4 year institution, and one thing that I have noticed that really does apply to many other different disciplines, including that of rhetoric and composition studies, is the way that the jargon we use in academic circles can alienate people, especially those that we actually want to welcome into the conversation. And a frequent point that I do discuss with students is what to do when the language used in an article isn't accessible to them. They don't understand it, or it's just a format that they can't quite engage with. And so I then see firsthand the frustration and the lack of confidence that comes from realizing that an article isn't readable for them.
So some of my more recent research and teaching practices have focused on universal design for learning as well as inclusive teaching, which I see is really going hand in hand. Both of these concepts are all about making learning materials more accessible, inclusive, and equitable. So the more I learned about Paul and his work with rhetorical equity, the more I saw the connections between UDL, inclusive teaching, and rhetorical equity. Frankly, they're all concerned with the audience, which is sort of the cornerstone of rhetoric and composition. Um, they're concerned with making your audience comfortable, with giving them different ways of learning and understanding, giving multiple examples, background knowledge, and so forth. So with that in mind, I think that the benefits of rhetorical equity are really inclusivity and access. Inviting people into the field, which is the opposite of how I felt when reading some of the CFPs that were over my head. Just to give a personal example, I'll walk you through a few of those elements. This is my article, Thinking Beyond Tools, and it was published in Computers and Composition Online. And a few of the things that I did that I think back now and realize I was engaging with rhetorical equity are evident here. So, for example, when I get to my findings from a large survey I did, I give readers choices so they can kind of pick and choose the themes from the data that they want to explore. So there's not one singular path to go through as they're reading. I also make sure to give context and background information, almost like a visual glossary of what I'm talking about. And then lastly, I make it interactive by designing some of our data visualizations as actual kind of moving pieces of the puzzle that the audience can interact with.
The concept, the benefits you're going to get from practicing rhetorical equity have to do with, moving beyond just like the technical access and the circulatory access, because those are really more, technological things like, is it going to reach, different people, right? The circulatory, do you have share buttons? Is it able to get to your audience? And then the other one, just the technical access, right? Is this information accessible to people with disabilities? But what rhetorical equity does that I think is really effective is it adds like reader preferences and also readability, like thinking about how it can be processed. And both these things are really important for engaging audiences and really unshaming them. So there's just some of the benefits just being able to reach a wider number of audiences. I often think with that CFP, like what if it was an infographic? What if there was some kind of Kahoot game that was connected to it? What other ways of presenting that information could have helped? And I just say that just because I know myself, before class sometimes, I'm not going to read, everything that Foucault's written on surveillance, before I teach something like that in like an upper level class. But I am going to go to Wikipedia and review it just because, there are time constraints in what I'm able to do. And I think, you've probably noticed like how time has become really important with regards to reading. Like, in Microsoft OneDrive, when you're looking at your documents, it says this is taking 20 minutes. You're like, oh my God. I think that deep reading dichotomy between deep reading and shallow reading is, just this sort of myth. It kind of depends on where you are and the times that you have. So it has to do with like preferences, And then the other one, just to do with readability, like making sure it's accessible. It's in a, sort of a language that, a wide variety of people can get, or you've got options for people to look at it. So if you think about rhetorical equity, right, the benefits are that you've got sort of a constellation of texts that could be revolving around, different audiences, or revolving around this place. Constellation of text is revolving around a planet of many audiences, and audiences kind of can grab those texts that are going to work for them in a particular situation. I guess the biggest drawback with regards to rhetorical equity is just the time it takes.
Just like Paul, I think the biggest drawback to rhetorical equity, if there is one, is time. Making your text more interactive, more accessible, more diverse is just naturally going to take more time to do that work. And the other challenge there is that work valued? Do our TNP committees or our deans or our department chairs care about this? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Just as an example, my most rhetorically equitable scholarship is the web text that I composed. It probably took me 2 or 3 times as long as any other article I've ever published. And from what I know anecdotally about my tenure and promotion review process, I don't think that reviewers put any more stock in this piece compared to others or understood the work.
Jenna coined this term on a project we were working on called resort to print. And it's just this idea that, there are all these exciting web texts and technologies and things that you can do. But it seems like a lot of the structures that we have limit academics from doing that, or making things in, rhetorically equitable ways. Just because of the time it takes and the technology and the need for collaboration. A lot of times collaboration takes more time. Learning new technologies takes more time, just to figure these things out and get these things working. So those are some of the major drawbacks. I mean, personally, I've had those issues with some of the compositions I've made that practice rhetorical equity. Just having to create like different interfaces in one text. I created, an infographic, a toggle between, and then more of an academic text.
Like both Paul and Jenna mentioned, a drawback to all of this is time. And all of that requires buy in and support from individual department heads, departments in general, on an institution level, and just from the academic field as a whole. I think that this is something that is important and invaluable and well worth the time investment and the resources that will be allocated to it, whether that's through writing the text with readability in mind, providing multiple ways to engage with the content using principles of universal design or UDL, ensuring that the content is available to people who may have some limited technology access, or publishing through open access.
There's some examples in academics. One was, I think, at Kairos, it talked about transmodality, and they had more of an academic-y text mixed with a podcast, and I can't remember what else they had. I've done 3 pieces now that practice rhetorical equity. One had an infographic and then just the academic text. Another had 3 interfaces. One was kind of webby, place was more interactive. It had different multimedia remixes and screenshots. Then it had like the academic text, but it also had an interface that worked kind of like Tinder or Bumble, because the research was on the Tinder and Bumble interface.
When talking about rhetorical equity, one concept is preferences, where we are thinking about the audience in terms of their kairotic needs and desires. And to me, this is a great example, the new work of composing, something as simple as the scattered table of contents that they created. You click one of the white theme buttons, and it reorganizes the table of contents and highlights based on particular topics of interest. This is a simple way of kind of curating information for the audience so that when someone needs something in the moment, they can find it. The new work of composing is also a good example of both the readability dimension as well as the technological dimension. So something as simple as this, where it says, how do I navigate this? And you get to an entire page that just talks to you about how this text, which is digital, is laid out and how you might read it and how you might read it in different ways. I think that this helps users who could be potentially intimidated by the structure or might just have a preference for reading in different ways.
In pop culture, the Deadpool series, if you've ever seen that, I think it was Deadpool 2 that had a second version come out around Christmas time that had Fred Savage, and he was reprising his role from The Princess Bride, and it was kind of funny, but it was also rated PG-13, so they kind of recut it to make this a new version. So that's sort of an example of rhetorical equity in pop culture. I think rhetorical equity, a lot of it, you can think about how transmedia storytelling has that sort of ethic. If you've seen, any of the big movie franchises where you have, ways to get into the text, be it comics, video games, TV series, or the movies, even books, just encouraging people to kind of find that fit for preference and readability. One thing that I think is really cool is just it's also getting all these new characters involved, things that people can identify with, getting audiences really engaged through identification.
Worth their time. And so, what I would like to see in the future is growing support for rhetorical equity in the field of rhetoric and composition studies, in other academic disciplines, and just really academia as a whole, and realizing that if we want to continue communicating in a way that others are able to understand and engage with, that we need to put the time in and allocate the resources for making sure that rhetorical equity is centered in our work.
I think that rhetorical equity should be a foundational concept in rhetoric and composition. It's challenging to understand the differences between rhetorical equity and rhetorical equality. So I think that's a good place to start if you're choosing to integrate the concept into the writing classroom. But the more you start thinking about text you compose in relationship to this concept of rhetorical equity, the more it starts to infuse the way you think. It's kind of like when you discover a new product and then you start seeing it everywhere for them. So now I have a framework as an instructor that I can apply to my work, to working with students. And I think students will benefit from having that rhetorical equity framework when they're thinking about how they compose.
I'm pretty ambivalent about the future of rhetorical equity. On the one hand, it's kind of cool. It seems like there's, a lot in pop culture that's, getting at that idea of rhetorical equity. And I think a lot of, books that are coming out, have interactive elements like textbooks kind of things and ways for, students at least to get at concepts at different ways that's going to help them. And, that I think it helps with both readability and preferences. I'm a little more concerned just with, how academics are able to accomplish this and really start, I guess, pushing the envelope, so to speak, with web texts and making things rhetorically equitable for each other, just because there is so much information out there. So not just for each other, right, but for other readers, people who may want to connect, not just academics, but growing academics like students who haven't, who are just on their beginning their academic path. It also sort of takes that, if you have texts that just have all these paratexts and not a singular text that's the all encompassing, almost like a holy text. I think it helps remove the stigma of non literary texts and gets rid of that idea that authors that can write the printed word are and only the printed word really well. Those are the ones that are very highly regarded. But I think we need more authors who can do a lot of things very well.